It's a Friday night in April 1942, Jacksonville Beach, Florida. People are out on the sand, music is drifting from a pier, couples walking, kids laughing. The war feels very far away. It's Europe's problem, after all. And then the ocean catches fire. 2 miles offshore, a 9,000-ton tanker named the SS Gulf America erupts in a column of flame. People scramble out of beach bars, flood the highways to get a better look. Some jump into rowboats to try and rescue survivors. The whole coastline glows orange. But here's what nobody on that beach could see. Silhouetted against the burning ship, barely 250 meters from the tanker, is a German submarine. And on its bridge stands a 29-year-old U-boat commander who is watching the Americans watch him and writing in his log, all the vacationers had seen an impressive special performance at Roosevelt's expense. His name was Reinhard Hardigan, and what happened off the coast of America in early 1942 is one of the most shocking military disasters in U.S. history, one that is almost completely forgotten. Historian Michael Gannon called it America's second Pearl Harbor, but in terms of material destruction, it was arguably worse. To understand how this could happen, how German submarines could park themselves just miles off American beaches and sink ships almost without opposition for 8 months, you have to go back 4 days after Pearl Harbor. December 11, 1941, Adolf Hitler, in what many historians consider one of his worst strategic decisions, declares war on the United States. He didn't have to. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor carried no obligation for Germany under the Tripartite Pact, but Hitler did it anyway, probably out of a misguided sense of solidarity and a belief that America was already an enemy. Within 24 hours of that declaration, Karl Donitz, the 50-year-old vice admiral commanding Germany's U-boat fleet, picks up the phone. He has been waiting for this moment for 2 years. Since 1939, his submarines had been strangling British supply lines in the North Atlantic. They had already sunk over 1,100 Allied ships totaling 5.27 million tons. And now America, unprepared, undefended, her coastline blazing with peacetime lights, had just been handed to him on a plate. Donitz called his plan Unternehmen Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat. But there was a problem, a serious one. The standard German workhorse submarine, the Type VII, didn't have the range to reach America's east coast from France and back. The distance from Lorient to New York is roughly 3,000 nautical miles. Even fully loaded with fuel, a Type VII would run dry long before it saw the Statue of Liberty. Donitz needed his larger boats, the Type IX, slow to dive, less maneuverable, but with a range of up to 10,000 miles. The problem, most of them were already deployed. Berlin was pulling submarines to Norway, to the Mediterranean to support Rommel's Africa Corps, to every theater except the one Donitz actually wanted to focus on. He asked for 12 Type IX boats. He got 5. 5 boats to take the war to the shores of the most powerful nation on Earth. Donitz reportedly paced his office at the U-boat headquarters in Lorient and muttered that 5 boats were barely enough to make a gesture. He was wrong. 5 boats turned out to be enough to trigger a catastrophe. On December 23, 1941, U-123 left Lorient. U-125 had already departed 5 days earlier. U-66, U-130, U-109 followed one after another. Each captain received sealed orders and a briefing on their patrol areas, the stretch of coast between Nova Scotia and Cape Hatteras. Each boat was loaded to capacity: fuel, food, 22 torpedoes. There was something almost comical about one detail of the planning. Because the operation required strict secrecy, no detailed military charts of the American coastline were issued from stores in Lorient. Hardigan of U-123 navigated using a standard nautical atlas and a pocket tourist guide that included a map of New York Harbor from the 1939 World's Fair. A tourist map. He used a tourist map to navigate his submarine to the shores of America. He would later describe approaching New York Harbor at night as one of the most beautiful sights he ever saw in his life. The city was entirely lit up, the skyscrapers glittering, traffic crossing the bridges, the whole city reflected in the water, completely oblivious to the steel predator lurking beneath the surface.
Here's where the story takes a turn that should make every American uncomfortable, even 80 years later. The U.S. Navy knew they were coming. Not in some vague, intelligence might suggest something way. They specifically knew. The British WII service, the listening stations that intercepted German radio traffic, had picked up signals from each U-boat as it left the Bay of Biscay. An analyst named Roger Wynne in London's submarine tracking room correctly deduced where they were headed and sent a detailed warning to the Americans, describing a heavy concentration of U-boats off the North American seaboard. The warning reached Rear Admiral Adolphus Andrews, the man responsible for defending the Atlantic coast from Maine to North Carolina. On January 12, 1942, Andrews was told directly 3 to 4 enemy submarines were about to commence operations against coastal shipping. What did he do? Nothing. Well, not nothing. He argued that implementing a convoy system would actually make things worse because convoys would just give U-boats more concentrated targets. This logic was baffling to the British, who had spent 2 years learning, through blood, exactly the opposite lesson. Ships sailing alone in the dark were easy kills. Ships and organized convoys with escorts were not. But Andrews had a real problem too, one that wasn't entirely his fault. Look at what he actually had to defend 1,500 miles of coastline. 7 Coast Guard cutters, 4 converted yachts, 3 patrol boats dating from 1919, 2 gunboats that were built in 1905, and 4 wooden submarine chasers. No modern destroyers, no long-range patrol aircraft, and about 100 short-range planes suitable mainly for training flights. Meanwhile, American cities along the coast refused to enforce a blackout. The British had been operating under strict blackout conditions since 1939, no light visible from the sea. The Americans? Atlantic City worried that turning off their famous boardwalk lights would damage tourism. Miami Beach hotel owners pushed back. The coastal towns kept their lights blazing, their lighthouses blinking, their navigational markers in place. And U-boat crews, surfacing at night after days submerged in darkness and diesel fumes, could not believe what they were seeing. Peter Kremer, captain of U-333, came up on the bridge off the Florida coast and later wrote that he and his crew rubbed their eyes in disbelief. We had left a blacked-out Europe behind us. The American shore appeared to them as a glittering, glowing feast. Every merchant ship passing in the darkness was perfectly silhouetted against the coastal lights, outlined like a paper target at a shooting range. Hardigan surfaced off Jacksonville Beach on an earlier patrol and could hear music from the pier. He could see people on the beach at St. Augustine. He could count the windows lit up on shore. He wrote in his log, "It is a pity there were not 10 or 20 submarines here instead of just one." The U-boat crews called this campaign the Amerikanische Schießsaison, the American shooting season.
January 12, 1942. Hardigan in U-123 is still off the coast of Nova Scotia, days ahead of his planned schedule. He spots the British freighter Cyclops sailing alone, 300 miles east of Cape Cod. She's carrying Chinese sailors and general cargo, 9,100 tons. His orders say to wait until he reaches his designated patrol area further south. But a 9,100-ton ship sailing without an escort, in the dark, is too good an opportunity. He fires 2 torpedoes. The Cyclops goes down. Of her 180 crew, 84 drown or freeze to death in the lifeboats. The rest survive. It is the first kill of Operation Drumbeat, and the alarm it should have triggered in Naval Command somehow produces only a ripple. 2 days later, January 14th, U-123 is now operating off New York. Hardigan sinks the Panamanian tanker Nornis overnight, then the British tanker Coimbra. The explosion from the Coimbra sends a column of fire 650 feet into the air. People standing on the beaches of Long Island and the Hamptons, 27 miles away, can see it clearly. Then, Hardigan does something remarkable. He navigates U-123 into New York Harbor itself. Using his tourist map and his considerable nerve, he gets close enough to see Manhattan's skyline reflected in the water. He doesn't fire, there aren't enough targets worth his torpedoes in the harbor, but he lingers, and his crew stares out at America's greatest city, lit up and completely unaware of the wolf at its gate. He writes, "I cannot describe the feeling with words, but it was unbelievably beautiful and great.
Then he turns south and starts hunting again. By January 19th, just 1 week into the campaign, Hartigan is off Cape Hatteras, the stretch of North Carolina coast known as the graveyard of the Atlantic, even before the U-boats arrived. On a single night, he sinks 3 freighters in shallow water, close enough to shore that the burning ships are visible from the beach. A few hours later, he encounters 5 more merchant ships traveling together and attacks, 2 more sinkings. He returns to Lorient, having sunk 9 ships, totaling 53,170 tons on a single patrol. Donitz sends him a radio message. To the drumbeater Hartigan, "Bravo, you beat the drum well." Hartigan receives the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military decoration. Meanwhile, the other 4 boats are racking up their own kills. U-131 sinks 6 ships, U-66 sinks 5, U-109 sinks 4. Even U-125, with a new captain on his first combat cruise, manages 1. 23 ships sunk, over 100,000 tons of Allied shipping destroyed, and the U.S. Navy hasn't sunk a single U-boat in return. The campaign is 3 weeks old.
Donitz reads Hartigan's after-action reports and draws the obvious conclusion. American waters are a killing field. He needs to send more boats. The problem remains the same: range. The Type VII submarines can't make the journey from France to America and back without refueling. But Donitz has a solution: a floating gas station. The Type 14 submarine, nicknamed the Milk Cow, is a specialized supply vessel that carries no weapons, only fuel, food, and spare torpedoes. On April 21, 1942, the U-459 positions itself 600 miles northwest of Bermuda and begins refueling U-boats in the mid-Atlantic. Over the next 2 weeks, it services 14 submarines, including Type 7s now small enough to be sent into shallower coastal waters and the Gulf of Mexico. This changes everything. Suddenly, Donitz can keep multiple submarines continuously on patrol in American waters. The killing intensifies. In May 1942, Axis submarines sink 115 ships. 101 of them are sailing independently, without escort. In June, 122 ships. The Gulf of Mexico becomes a new hunting ground. Tankers carrying oil from Texas and Louisiana ports are picked off one by one. The oil that doesn't reach the eastern seaboard is oil that doesn't fuel Allied aircraft, ships, and tanks. But here's the detail that makes the full human tragedy clear. The sailors dying in these waters aren't soldiers. They aren't Navy men with warships for protection and training for combat. They're merchant mariners, civilian sailors, many of them, on tankers and cargo ships with minimal armament and no convoy protection. When a torpedo hits a loaded oil tanker, the survivors often find themselves swimming through burning oil. The Atlantic off Hatteras that spring smells of petroleum and death. Beaches in North Carolina begin collecting bodies. Tar balls and oil slicks wash ashore for hundreds of miles. And in a decision that should live in infamy, American authorities imposed a news blackout on the sinkings. The Navy's official public communications suggested that U-boats were being hunted successfully, that many submarines would never enjoy the return portion of their voyage. The Navy even asked civilians who witnessed sinkings to keep quiet about what they'd seen, implying they might be revealing sensitive military information. The real secret, as historian Clay Blair later documented, was that there was no secret. Through the summer of 1942, the U.S. Navy had not sunk a single U-boat off the American coast. The official confidence was entirely fabricated. It is April 11, 1942, a Saturday night. Hartigan has returned for his second patrol, this time targeting the Florida coast. The SS Gulf America is a brand-new steam tanker on its maiden voyage, loaded with 101,500 barrels of furnace oil, heading from Port Arthur, Texas to New York City. She passes Jacksonville Beach at 10:20 p.m., running her navigation lights. The beach below is busy.
A Florida weekend. People at the restaurants, the bars, on the pier, strolling the sand. Families in beach houses with their windows open to the warm April night. Hartigan fires a torpedo. The SS Gulf America erupts. The blast shakes windows in Jacksonville. The orange glow is visible for miles. And what happens next is almost surreal. Instead of panic, the American shoreline responds with curiosity. People stream out of their houses. Cars jam the coastal highways. People are driving toward the explosion to get a better look. Hartigan watches this through his periscope. He sees the crowds gathering on the beach. He makes a decision that is either tactically brilliant or horrifyingly arrogant, depending on how you look at it. The tanker is still floating, on fire but not yet sunk, and he wants to finish the job with his deck gun. But if he fires from the seaward side, shells could pass over the burning ship and hit the beach houses, hitting the crowd of civilians who have gathered to watch. So he maneuvers U-123 between the burning tanker and the shore. He gets within 250 meters of the Gulf America, in water barely 20 meters deep, illuminated by the tanker's own flames, fully visible to anyone on the beach with a weapon. He opens fire with his deck gun. The highways to Jacksonville Beach are packed. People in rowboats paddle out toward the burning ship to rescue survivors. 19 crew members of the Gulf America die that night, some from the initial torpedo explosion, others drown in the dark water. Civilian beachgoers are among those who pull survivors from the sea. Hartigan writes in his log, all the vacationers had seen an impressive special performance at Roosevelt's expense. A burning tanker, artillery fire, the silhouette of a U-boat. How often had that been seen in America? He lingers a moment too long. Aircraft from nearby airfields begin dropping parachute flares to locate him. A destroyer and patrol boats converge. U-123 crash dives in 20 meters of water, barely enough depth for a submarine. She lies on the bottom, holding still while depth charges shake the sea around her. Eventually, the Americans give up the search. U-123 slips away into deeper water and heads home to France.
How does something like this happen? How does the most powerful nation in the world allow enemy submarines to conduct warfare just miles from its coastline, in sight of its beaches, for 8 months without an effective response? The answers are uncomfortable. First, institutional arrogance. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, was resistant to adopting British anti-submarine tactics he'd had little role in developing. The British had spent 2 years learning, expensively, that convoys with air cover were the solution. King initially dismissed convoy recommendations as impractical. He argued that an inadequately escorted convoy was worse than no convoy. There is something to this argument, but the British had data to the contrary, and King's delay in implementing even a partial system cost hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. Second, bureaucratic territorialism. The U.S. Army Air Forces controlled the large, long-range aircraft that could patrol the coast effectively, but the relationship between the Navy and the USAAF was, in the polite language of the official histories, traditionally antagonistic. Neither service could agree on who should control anti-submarine aircraft, while they argued the U-boats hunted. Third, public deception. The Navy's information management during this period is a disturbing chapter. Newspapers were pressured to downplay or omit reports of sinkings. The systematic silencing of merchant mariners and coastal witnesses meant that the American public had almost no idea that an undeclared sea war was being fought within sight of their beaches. Tar on the sand, oil on the water, bodies washing ashore, and official silence. The first U-boat sunk by American forces wasn't until April 14, 1942, 3 full months into the campaign. The USS Roper finally caught U-85 off Cape Hatteras and sent her to the bottom. It was celebrated as a breakthrough. It was also a lonely exception. It wasn't until May 14, 1942, 4 months after the killing started, that the first organized coastal convoy sailed from Hampton Roads to Key West.
The effect was immediate and dramatic. Sinkings off the East Coast plummeted. Donitz noticed and shifted his U-boats elsewhere, to the Gulf of Mexico, then back to the North Atlantic, then to the Caribbean. But he had already won his campaign. By the time convoys became standard, the damage was done.
Let's stop and let the statistics do the talking for a moment, because they are staggering. During the second happy time, January to August 1942, Axis submarines sank 609 ships totaling 3.1 million tons. They did this for the loss of just 22 U-boats, a kill ratio so one-sided it barely seems real. That 3.1 million tons represented roughly 1/4 of all shipping ever sunk by U-boats during the entire Second World War, concentrated in just 8 months in American waters. In the first 6 months alone, more than 360 merchant ships went down off the coast of North America and in the Caribbean, representing about 2.25 million gross tons. The oil, fuel, ammunition, food, and raw materials those ships were carrying, bound for Britain, for the Allied war effort, for the factories and the armies, much of it never arrived. Michael Gannon, who wrote the definitive history of the campaign, argued that in terms of lost resources and material, this was the costliest defeat of World War II for America, not Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor killed more people in a single morning, but the second happy time killed the supply chain that was supposed to fuel the Allied war machine. And it didn't have to be this way. The British had offered advice from the beginning: institute convoys, enforce blackouts, deploy air cover. All of it was largely ignored for months. The U.S. Navy had sufficient warning that U-boats were coming. They had enough ships to at least make the Germans' task more difficult, but organizational paralysis, bureaucratic rivalry, strategic miscalculation, and a failure of imagination allowed the enemy to operate almost unchallenged in American waters for the better part of a year.
Reinhardigan survived the war. He went on to command U-boats in training, then served in land operations, was briefly captured after VE Day and released in 1946. He went into business, the heating oil business, which must have struck him with a certain irony given the number of oil tankers he had sent to the bottom. In 1990, historian Michael Gannon published Operation Drumbeat, the book that finally told the full story of what happened off the American coast in 1942. It became a bestseller. And Hardigan, then 78 years old, traveled to the United States, gave interviews, met survivors of ships he had sunk, stood on the beaches of Jacksonville. One of the most remarkable encounters came when Hardigan met a survivor of the SS Gulf America, the man whose ship had burned in front of an audience of Florida beachgoers on that April night in 1942. They shook hands. A Jacksonville historian who knew both men said, "There were guys who sank more ships, but nobody did it with an audience like Hardigan did." Hardigan died on June 9, 2018, at the age of 105, the last of Germany's U-boat aces. He had become, in his final decades, a quiet advocate for German-American friendship, visiting the United States regularly, attending memorial services, speaking to students. He represented Germany's Knight's Cross holders at ceremonies until he was well into his 90s. Near the end of his life, he reportedly said, "Now I sink putts, not ships."
So what are we supposed to take from this story? There's the obvious lesson about military preparedness, about what happens when bureaucratic inertia and institutional ego are allowed to override practical intelligence and combat-tested advice. The British told the Americans what to do. They had the data. The Americans ignored it. People died because of that gap between knowledge and action. But there's a deeper, stranger lesson here that stays with me. The second happy time happened because of normalcy bias on a national scale. American cities kept their lights on because turning them off would hurt tourism and business. Merchant ships kept sailing their regular routes without escort because that's how they'd always operated. Coastal commanders kept waiting for the problem to get bad enough to justify the disruption of a convoy system, while ships burned 2 miles from their shores. We are remarkably good, as a species, at convincing ourselves that the worst-case scenario won't happen, that the threat is exaggerated, that the established way of doing things will suffice, that the disruption required to protect against danger is too costly, too inconvenient, too politically unpopular. And sometimes, when the threat is patient enough and smart enough and close enough, that assumption gets corrected in fire. The U-boats off America's coast in 1942 weren't some unprecedented, unforeseeable catastrophe. They were an entirely predictable consequence of choosing comfort over preparation. The British had been fighting this exact kind of submarine warfare for 2 years. The lessons existed, the warnings were issued, the advice was available. And on the beaches of Jacksonville and Cape Hatteras and Long Island and 100 other places along the eastern seaboard, people watched the ocean catch fire and thought it was a spectacle.
The SS Gulf America sank 4 days after Hartigan torpedoed her in 65 feet of water off Jacksonville Beach. She still lies there today, a wreck that divers can explore, the rusting bones of a ship that burned in front of a crowd on a Friday night while a German submarine watched. Off Cape Hatteras, the stretch of coast the U-boat crews called the most productive hunting ground in the entire war, the seafloor is littered with wrecks from this campaign. You can dive on them today, the cargo holds, the oil tanks, the gun mounts. The graveyard of the Atlantic Museum in Hatteras preserves artifacts from U-85, the first U-boat sunk by American forces, a German uniform, torpedo parts, deck fittings. You can look through a replica periscope and see the coast the way a U-boat commander saw it. 8 months, 609 ships, 3.1 million tons, and the cities kept their lights on. If you found this story as haunting as I do, share it. Leave a comment about what surprised you most. I genuinely read all of them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the kind of history we cover here. The forgotten stories, the uncomfortable truths, the moments where the gap between what we knew and what we did made all the difference. Stay curious.